Welcome to Ask UAS, where kids can find answers. Thank you. She's the one with the PhD, so she reminded me to put my mic up. Um, and this is the last presentation for our spring semester, but we will be back in the fall. We've already started the lineup, so we encourage you not only to go back either on Facebook or our UAS YouTube channel. You can watch past presentations, and this will be up in a little bit. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Charmaine Robinson. She is the professor of science here at UAS Ketchikan. Her bachelor's is in cell biology from UC Davis, and she's earned her PhD in genetics also from UC Davis. She's a scientific diver and has worked in the past as a dive safety officer for the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And in fall semester, she will be teaching anatomy, physiology, geology, and nutrition. So if you like this lecture, we know where you can get some more. So thank you, Dr. Robinson.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Get myself all attached up and standing in the right position so we can successfully record everything for tonight. So before I even get into it, I think I just wanted to thank everybody for being here, the folks who are here in person. It's really, I can't even begin to express how nice it is to like see faces and smiles and be together in person versus just speaking over Zoom or over phone calls and things like that, which I think we've all kind of been exposed to more or less depending on our occupations over the last couple of years. But also a big welcome to and hello to the folks who are tuning in from online and listening via Facebook. Appreciate your time. So my title's up here on the slide with a nice picture of a diver. And the title's Alaskan Scuba Divers, Cold Hands, Warm Hearts. And the reality of the physiology is it really should be cold hands and cold hearts. But that just sounds pretty negative or scary, or like divers are mean people, which is couldn't be further from the truth. But I like that old saying, cold hands and warm hearts. And it kind of gets at what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is hands and diving. And we are, if I can get my little clicker to work, I was going to move to the next slide, but I know it's a lot juggling all the different technology to get this to be kind of shown online and in person. And before I even go any further chatting about what I did in this little pilot research project and about divers and hands and why they might be cold, I do want to thank and acknowledge those folks who kind of helped this project happen. I think that's a really big, important part of science that often gets overlooked is thanking people. And most especially, I wanted to thank Joel Marcus, who's a professor and director of the program up at Sitka. So he's at our UAS campus that's up in Sitka, which is where this project that I'm talking to you about tonight, that's where it took place. So huge thanks to him for hosting me and being welcoming and letting me dive with him in his Alaska dive semester. And then also a lot of gratitude to my friend and colleague, John Detka. He's based down at UC Santa Cruz, and he's just an absolute whiz at statistics, which is not necessarily my strong suit, but really necessary when you have a big data set. And John's just been huge with helping me try to weed through kind of the analysis on this project too. So the research question that I had for this project was really broad. So I asked what correlations exist between cold water diving and manual dexterity. So that's super broad. I was hoping that the data would then help me kind of narrow down and get some more specific questions. So this really was kind of a, can I do this type of project initially? And then to break it down, I think everyone in the room knows what cold is and knows what water is, but the manual dexterity part might be a little more new for you to think about. And so what is manual dexterity? I've got these two images up here on the slide, and The one on the left is a diver underwater, and they're holding a compass. So simple tool, pretty small, fits in your hand, and probably a simple example of a manual dexterity skill, and more on the range. So the way to think about manual dexterity is it has ranges, so from gross movements to fine movements. So gross movement would be like, can I pick up, this clicker here that I'm using for the presentation? I can hold it in my hand, I can grip it, I can place it back down. But I'm using muscle skills, I'm using nervous system skills, the joints are moving, so all of that is at play there with my hand. Versus maybe more of a fine skill, manual dexterity, which would be the image, cartoon kind of picture here on the right, which shows two hands threading a needle, which also involves some eyesight and maybe other challenges that we may have. But that's a really fine skill movement coordination that's happening using your hands. So manual dexterity is, by loose definition, just skillful manipulation of our hands. But we do that all day long, right? And our jobs, we may do it more or less depending on our occupation. But for sure, scuba divers are using their hands constantly, whether it's to work their own equipment or to work scientific equipment if they're a scientific diver. If they're an occupational or commercial diver, they're using tools and other types of equipment. They may be touching organisms if they're harvesting. So all this stuff is kind of wrapped into this idea of, can we use our hands and do they function well while cold and underwater? And I think the basic answer of that that we know is, well, no, they don't work that well in cold, and everyone in Alaska kind of has a sense of that. So, but just to get into more detail of, well, why is there that negative correlation that the colder the temperatures, the longer the exposure that we have, the less amount of manual dexterity that we have? This project, I really wanted to quantify that a bit more and tease it out. So which aspects of dexterity are most affected by cold water diving? So first bullet point here, vasoconstriction. So all of our blood vessels that are running through our body, one of the first things our body does when it's exposed to cold, whether that's in air or underwater, it tries to protect your vital organs. So that's your brain, your heart. So it's going to try to reduce the amount of blood flowing out to your extremities because those are closer up to the surface, especially small capillaries in your skin. And if they cool as they're becoming in contact with that cold environment, they're going to circulate back to your heart. And that's where we get that cold heart, cold hands. And that cooler blood will actually start to cool your heart, cool your brain, cool your internal organs, which is not good. So we don't want that to happen. So that's why your body responds with that kind of risky, well, we might lose some fingers, we might lose some toes, but we're going to keep the rest of the vital stuff happy, healthy, getting oxygen with blood flow. So we see vasoconstriction in our hands when they're exposed to cold. The other thing we see is actually slow nerves. So that nervous system communication from our central nervous system or our brain kind of connecting down to our hands and telling us, okay, Charmaine, grip, pick up this little clicker. That's a whole line of communication that's happening with our nervous system. And it's actually, it gets into kind of a little more gnarly molecular details that I didn't want to get into tonight, but it's sufficient for us to think about, well, that communication line is slower with cold. So the colder the temperature, again, the longer the exposure, the less fast our nerves are firing. And then the third thing that's happening is in your joints. So everybody who's at home or here in the room, if you look down at your hands and you kind of think about bending them, they have a lot of joints in them, right? Each finger's got multiple joints. So again, for our hands to function well, they've got to be able to articulate. So joint is just where you've got two skeletal bones kind of coming together and they're moving, they're articulating. The ones in our hands are called synovial joints. So we have different types of joints in our body. The synovial ones, they actually have fluid in them. So it's a little kind of fluid-filled pocket. And just like, I think most of you, if you've ever seen a glass of water that you stick outside in December and catch a can, the water may or may not, depending on the December, freeze, right? It'll actually kind of, or at least get kind of slushy. Or if you've ever put like a soda in the freezer, the liquid actually becomes more of a solid. Well, that liquid in our synovial joints, it doesn't actually freeze solid, but it starts to head in that direction and it gets real sluggish. So that's why if you've ever, whether you're a diver or not, you just go outside, you hike with your dog again in cold weather, that's hard. It's harder to actually bend our hands and bend those joints because that synovial fluid is starting to freeze. Now, there's also a lot of other aspects that come into play there too, not just the environmental exposure, right? We've got whether you're dealing with inflammation or arthritis, or there's a million factors that also affect our joints and our hand. But if we just focus on the effects of cold, these are kind of some of the big ones that we see. And then I've got this great picture of this person coming out of like a cold plunge here. Just to differentiate between air and water, all these things are happening in cold air. They're also happening in cold water. And I know there are some divers in the room and maybe some divers listening online. And I'm hoping you remember from your open water class. So water actually pulls heat from our bodies 25 times faster than air does. So that's significant. So that means all these effects are happening 25 times faster to a diver than they are just to the person hiking their dog on a cold day. So it's something that just to take into account as far as that effect on manual dexterity. Let me see if I can get. So a great question with any research is why give me money? Why fund this? Why do this? Why take up people's time? What's the rationale behind it? So there were a lot of whys for me. Some of this was intercampus collaboration that was happening and some student learning outcomes that were also wrapped into this. But what I thought I'd share with the folks listening tonight, it has to do with our big commercial dive community here in Southeast Alaska. So we've got a couple pictures of commercial divers up here, and they tend to use different types of gloves. They're underwater for different amounts of time. They've got a lot of variability that may or may not affect their manual dexterity, which may or may not affect their safety, right? If we can't operate our equipment because our hands are kind of frozen up, that could become a safety issue. So I was hoping, and it may not come out of this data set, it may come out of future as I keep collecting data, to perhaps provide some information to inform decision like, what gloves do I buy? What works better for me may not work for another person, but if I've got some kind of baseline data, then it might inform that, those decisions. And you can even see, for those of you who aren't divers, the image on the left, the diver's got, it's kind of a orange, red colored, so they're dry gloves, so meaning that water that pulls the heat from the body 25 times faster, the water's not actually in contact with the skin on the hand, theoretically, if it's sealed correctly. So that's one glove type that a lot of our commercial divers use and recreational divers. And then on the right, the diver has kind of one glove off as he's adjusting his helmet and then one glove on, but the glove that's on is a neoprene. So that's providing insulation, some protection against cold effects, but the water can actually come into contact with the skin. So again, you've got that kind of heat being pulled away. The physics of the cold water is touching the hand. So that's one of the pieces of why do this work, is possibly to help inform these groups of folks who are out there working hard in cold conditions. So methods of this, I went up to Sitka. So I needed some divers. So I went up to Sitka and worked with Joel Marcus and found me some divers. So I had 15 divers in this study. 6 were females, 9 were males. They were all in the age range of 20 to 41. And they all happened to be right-handed. That wasn't by design, it was just how it turned out. I'm actually left-handed, but I didn't collect data on myself. I was busy collecting data on them. But it would be nice to kind of see, because I did break down some of the analysis between dominant hand and non-dominant hand, because sometimes we've got different dexterity levels depending on how we use our hands. So that was what the divers kind of breakdown of the divers looked like. And then what we did is a lot of testing on them. So I tested them both pre-dive and post-dive. So the pre-dive was in a room, just like this one. Everyone's warm and comfy, cozy, and that acted as a baseline or a control for each individual diver was their own control in that way. So if I can test how my manual dexterity is while warm and at room temp, then I test it, okay, right after a dive is come out. We run them through these tests to see what those cold effects were. And we collected a lot of body metrics like height, weight, heart rate, oxygen saturation, their temperature, of course, their dive depth and time. Glove type, so these were students, so they were trying out dry gloves, they were trying out 3 millimeter neoprene gloves with 5 fingers to them. They also tried 7 millimeter, so that's a thicker, little bit warmer glove. Some folks had mitts, so where just like you think of like a ski mitt, where all 4 of the fingers are kind of clustered together. So there was a variety of different glove types, so we recorded that data. And then the kind of more interesting, fun stuff that looks at dexterity were those last 3 bullet points. So that was grip strength. So that's using, I brought props with me today. So that's using, it's called a grip dynamometer. Pretty basic tool. Your hands fit in there and you kind of pinch it together and you can get a sense of either in pounds or kilograms how strong your grip strength is. And we also looked at pinch strength, which is more of an analog version of the grip dynamometer. This one's a pinch dynamometer. And so you pinch this middle kind of button area and it gives you a reading on, again, you can use kilograms or pounds to look at strength between what I tested was thumb and pointer finger. So kind of that pinching motion that you might make. So we looked at that and then we ran a variety of dexterity tests. And the image I've got up here was kind of just, I think the folks, I know there's at least a couple biologists and scientists in the room who have done, I'm sure, all kinds of different research. Whenever you're doing research out in the field, and certainly when you add humans as a research subject, things get kind of wild and crazy. So it was a challenge in itself just to be able to set this up literally on the beach with wind and rain and all the conditions going on. And this happened just last month in March. So we had some kind of cold, windy days up in Sitka. And the divers were awesome about it, though. They jumped right into it and kind of got the work done. So the other piece is we needed to go diving. So I did this for 4 different dives across 3 sites. The sites which are shown here are really kind of varied. The one on the left is like a typical beach site for Southeast Alaska, so shore diving. And then the site on the right was a little more kind of an urban setting, coming off of a working dock. And I should mention all these dives were working dives for these students, so they're working on their scientific diving certification. So they, unrelated to the project, they would go down and they're working with transects, which are like a tape measuring kind of tool, or PVC pipes, building things, or writing down on slates as far as different kind of organism surveys. So they had goals and objectives for their dives kind of unrelated to my research project. So they're using their hands is the important part while underwater. They weren't just kind of floating around looking at pretty nudibranchs and things like that. So, and the average water temperature for these dives was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the average temperature across these days was about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And all the dives were in Sitka. So then I came back home, and this is the piece about the student learning outcomes. So I teach anatomy physiology here in Ketchikan in person. And all those students, they're not divers, but they're aspiring to be in the medical profession in various ways. So they're interested in physiology. So I brought them a bunch of real physiology data and physiology tools like this grip dynamometer that you can kind of see in that picture there. And they were able to use the same tools the divers used and be able to practice with that. I also introduced the idea of research methods to them. They designed their own kind of mini experiments. So we really collaborated between myself, Joel Marcus up in Sitka, and me here with 2 different courses. We linked a diving course and a physiology course, and tried to kind of show that broader impacts to those students. And so this image actually is our creek right out here, outside of the library, outside of campus, which the water is quite a bit colder this time of the year anyway, or when this was taken, than certainly than the ocean that we were diving in. So props to my students for putting their hands in there and seeing how that worked. They were totally game to do it. And I think they had a good time doing it. Definitely got competitive, I think, at times too. And I introduced them to the idea of some basic data analysis and statistics as well. So what did it look like? Some of the results, and I thought you guys would really like to be able to see, especially these dexterity tests that you may not have ever seen before. So this one, it's a video, and I'm gonna play it kind of while I talk about it, but it's called the Purdue Pegboard Dexterity Test. And it looks a lot like a cribbage board, if you've ever played that game. So you've got these little metal pegs, and you've got these 2 rows of holes, and you do this test kind of one hand at a time. So either the left hand is picking up pegs and putting them in the left-hand column, or the right hand's doing the right-hand column. And then your score is how many pegs can you get in 30 seconds. So you're timed. So everybody's timed at 30 seconds. A high level of manual dexterity would be a lot of pegs that you can just throw in there. A low level of manual dexterity would be fewer pegs. So for example, in this video, there was only, it looks like 5 that the diver got in. This was a really cold day that we had, actually a lot of wind chill too, which was a factor coming out of the water. And so again, we did this test actually multiple times at room temperature, so they kind of got a threshold, just a learning curve alone. Because I think the big piece with manual dexterity, there's a lot of cognitive involvement there too. So just being able to pick up tiny little pegs and put them in a hole, everyone's going to have a different level, but that's why they're a control for themselves as well. So that was one of the dexterity tests that I used. And then the other one is called a Minnesota manual dexterity test. And this one, we got pretty good at having people, try to see if I can get the video to play. We got pretty efficient at like running multiple divers through these tests as quickly as possible so their hands didn't warm up. And they really liked this one. I don't know if it's because they're college students or what, but so they're pucks, and they're kind of red on one side, black on the other, which makes it visually easy to tell when you're done. But your score in this case, instead of number, like it was in the pegs, this one is how fast. So you're timed, and the faster you are at it, the better your manual dexterity. And you just have to flip over each one. And what you may not have caught is you actually are switching hands between rows. So you're picking up with the right, flipping it over and setting it with the left. Pick up with the right, set it with the left, pick up with the right, set it with the left. And then when you get to the next row, pick up with the left, set it with the right, pick up with the left, set it with the right. So you're actually also, again, that cognitive piece of communication with your brain. So that's is all kind of part of this. And both of these tests, the Minnesota Manual and the Purdue Pegboard, are often used in a lot of occupational testing that they do, both for research and just for job interviews, for folks that work in factories and things like that, where they use a lot of repetitive manual dexterity. So these are well documented in the literature, but again, mainly for folks who work in cold environments or just non-cold environments even, but not on divers, so not on folks that are underwater in cold. So this is kind of a new application of these tests. And then I didn't want to throw a ton of graphs at you, so I am still kind of plowing through all the data. I just collected this about a month ago, so I'm hoping this summer I'll have some time when I'm not diving to analyze, have more time to actually get into the statistics of it. But what I have done is some exploratory data analysis. And what that means is you're just looking initially at trends that you might be seeing, and then you kind of, no pun intended, but you dive deeper and do more sophisticated statistics if you see that there is a trend. If there's no trend or no correlation, then you ignore that set of metrics that you measured because they're not meaningful essentially. So I did all these different tests, but now I have to find out which of them are actually meaningful. And what I wanted to share with you guys tonight was this grip versus pinch. So if you look at the left-hand graph, and it says grip, and then what you've got, and it might be kind of hard to see, but on the left is data for the male divers, and on the right is data for the female divers. And your Y vertical axis is the grip strength. So that was using this tool, if you remember, and it's in kilograms on this. And then along the x-axis or the horizontal axis is dive number. So dive 0 is the room temperature control one. Dive 1 is just their first dive they did that week. Second dive they did that week. Third dive, fourth dive. And if you look at the focus just on the grip one for right now, pretty flat line. There's not really a whole lot of like ups or downs. So by the fourth dive, their grip is essentially as strong as it was at room temperature. No, not a statistical difference in that range. And then if you focus on the right graph, which says pinch underneath, same kind of setup. You've got males on the left and females on the right. Pinch strength, so that smaller kind of thumb and forefinger strength is on the y-axis, and then the x-axis is your dive number again. And for both, males have a stronger grip, stronger pinch. That's not surprising. But for pinch, there's a definite negative slope to that correlation. So by dive 4, their pinch strength is statistically weaker. So what does that mean? Right, you can make a lot of different correlations with that. I do need to do more statistics on it and analyze it a little further before I can really say anything solid. But initially, when I think about divers, and I'm a diver, a lot of the stuff we do is pinch movements. So we connect a lot of things using metal bolt snaps. That's a pinch kind of movement that we make to open and close those. The male-female connectors, plastic connectors on BCDs that folks use when they're diving, that's a pinching kind of motion. So we do use that pinching motion quite a bit as divers. So that's a little interesting to think about, that if you're doing repetitive diving over the course of a week, and I didn't even look at, for this study, repetitive dives within a day, that would be maybe even more dramatic, but that we are seeing a strength decrease over time. So that was kind of the initial piece there, and conclusions that I can make, again, nothing, statistically yet, still working on that. But the inter-campus collaboration was really successful. The fact that Joel and I were able to come together and work in person, dive in person. We've got a lot of exciting future collaborations that we're kind of stewing up here. And then as far as the students, again, just having scientific divers exposed to research and physiology research was huge. And having my anatomy physiology students here exposed to that was really beneficial for them. And this image is just another one of those beautiful Southeast Alaska beaches there up in Sitka. Divers were just coming out of the water at this point. And I should have mentioned it kind of at the beginning, but I would happy to take questions throughout, but you've all been just sitting and listening and absorbing. And so at this point, if you do have any questions for me, I know I went through some things quickly, but yeah, we do.
I have a silly one. The pinch test, and you had the scope in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Were they just getting tired of pinching, or was it the cold?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I'll repeat just so that we pick it up on the mic and it's recorded for the folks online. So the question was, with the pinch data that we were looking at, and I can see if I can go back to it, was it just that they're getting tired, they're just worn out? It's like you're doing weightlifting reps at the gym, and by your last one, you're definitely experiencing that muscle fatigue, or was it the cold? And so I think you may have seen more fatigue if these were dives within the same day, but within a 24-hour, they weren't pinching that often that they would feel a lot of fatigue from that. We noticeably saw that, though, if we ran multiple replicates in the same day, like at room temperature. So that was an adjustment. I was originally going to take 4 replicates. So they pinch, take the number down, pinch again, take the number down, do that 4 times. But that was huge. We were seeing it just like exactly like you're saying, it got very weak because they're tiring out that muscle temporarily. And so we backed that down to a replicate of 3. So all these measurements are taken in replicates, and then the average is what I'm analyzing. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. Any others? Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand. So with the pinch test, these dives are on subsequent days. So a dive, you do the test, you dive the next day, you do the test,
Right.
and they're actually getting weaker.
Right.
You know, it's been a whole day since I've done the test, so
Right.
that seems unusual.
Yeah, so the question was again about this pinch data in the pinch test, and that it would seem unusual. You would think your body would recover. I think if I'm paraphrasing for you, that by day 4, even so, each dive was there's just one dive a day because it's a course. I just worked myself into a course. So I would like, as a side note, this is data. This is research I would love to continue with other folks. So Department of Fish and Game has divers, the commercial divers out here. So that would be a really different scenario because you'd get multiple dives in the same day, that kind of thing. So as an initial pilot study, they did have 24 hours to recover essentially between dives, and yet we're seeing their strength significantly decline over the course of a week. So some of that, what I will speak to, having been a diver myself and collected some physiology data, is diving's exhausting. And even if you have 24 hours to recover, so to speak, it's still, if you're doing and you're a new diver, these are all kind of newish divers, doing a dive per day for 4 days in a row, and schlepping gear, so they're doing other things besides diving. They're also carrying tanks up and down beaches and carrying big tubs and bins and equipment. So they're doing kind of a fair amount of work. So I think it's just by that Friday, they're tired. Yeah, which might be unrelated to the cold exposure. That's where so many variables come in and affect this, which is hard to tease that out with like a non-laboratory setting, non-controlled environment. Yeah. Any other questions? Any questions from online? I know we're monitoring that too. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I just started to. So the question was whether kind of the analysis or results of the different glove types. So far, I haven't seen a lot of correlation between it. I think I would need, realistically, or at least my friend who's the guru in statistics is like, you need more numbers to really be able to, like, more dives under the same glove type and then switch gloves for that same individual. Because you really can't, one thing you can't do with this type of work is compare between individuals, where our physiology is so different enough, as you can even see with males versus females, age differences, whether we've had caffeine, all these things affect our exposure to cold and our reaction to it. Whether you have alcohol in your system or have had alcohol in your system in the last 24 hours, the amount of food you ate, the fat and protein you had, like all that stuff really affects our ability to like operate in cold conditions. So if I can just compare within a person for glove type, then it may be that I need more numbers. I need to collect more data. But that's something I'd like to do, because heck, that could inform, especially per individual, what glove they're using that's most comfortable, but gives them the best dexterity. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, yes. So the question was, is there age limitation for diving? There's a low, like a young, on the range of ages from young to old, or young to seasoned, I think is the one I really like. There's a limitation on the young age. So depending on the certification agency, most start around 10 years old for like a junior type of certification, which involves always having an adult with them diving. But the upper age range, so long as you're medically fit by a doctor who might assess that, there's no upwards age range. You can keep diving till you're till as long as you want. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, great question. So I'll just repeat for the online folks. The question was between whether this data that I collected was from what's called a free diver, which is when you hold your breath and you go under the water and spend as much time as you can before you kind of run out of that air volume in your lungs and come up, or whether it's what we call scuba divers, which they're breathing off of a tank. This data was all from scuba divers breathing off a tank, yeah, on their back. Exactly. Yeah, also would be a physiologically really different for a free diver, someone holding their breath. That has a whole other, your body puts your body in a whole different sort of physiology than it does when you're breathing the compressed air off the tank. Generally, yeah. So the question was for the free diver, the breath hold divers, they have to have good lung capacity or good lungs. You'd be surprised. I don't know. I've known some really good free divers though that smoke cigarettes and do things you wouldn't think would help with. But it is. I would say, and I know there's another question. Training helps. So like just like we go to the gym and get stronger. I think folks that they really build up. So it is something you can get better at. You can train your body and change your physiology enough that your breath hold capacity is a lot longer. Yeah, in a short period of time too, surprisingly. Yeah, yeah. Question in the back and then.
I don't know if you've heard about it, but record holder lives somewhere around Kona. It's an older person, I believe it's a woman, for apnea. That's what's your breath down there. It's an older person. They claim it's something about the mental, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an amazing amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was just about the record holders for breath hold and freediving, which a lot of them come out of Hawaii. They do a lot of competitions out there. It is incredible. It's absolutely, that sport is such an interesting one. Yeah, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole with that if you want to look up online all the amazing records and things that folks have done with the breath hold. And definitely the comment was also related to age. Which I think there's a lot. So I'm also happen to be an endurance athlete, which is something that's increased a lot as I've gotten older. So there's some things that have to do with endurance. Our physiology is better the older we become. Young is better at quick speed, quick bursts of energy. And so there may be something related a little with that, with breath hold and the mental kind of strength too that goes into that. I think that's an increase with age type of thing too. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was about how deep the divers were going. I don't remember. I did indeed collect that. I don't know if I can get back to that slide here that has some of the metrics that we collected. So yeah, we recorded depth and time. Again, that's something I'd like to get more numbers on with deeper dives. So these were training students, so they're a little more limited on their depth. They weren't going to anything much, greater than 30 feet because they're still in training. But that's definitely another future direction to take this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was just taking all of this data points and graphing them. Yeah, it's a lot of work. This is why I need to do this summer. I haven't had much time finishing up semester and just all the things with. But yeah, I need to look at each one individually and then in pairs. And so that starts to get into some kind of linear regression stuff that's going to get a little hairy statistically because it's a multivariate. It's not just two variables that you're comparing multiple. And it's not what we call normally distributed, meaning like a bell curve. It doesn't look like that. So you have to kind of do some more math magic with it to make it fit a different model and then see whether there's any significance. Yeah. Do you have an online one? Oh, okay. Oh, nice. Oh, the comment was just from our online folks that I'm getting some love from Monterey, which is awesome. That yeah, Monterey, California is, will always be dear to my heart, and there's a bunch of amazing divers down there and some cool research happening down there too. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments? Alan, yeah.
Your research indicates that the dexterity decreased more with each progressive dive, or did it reach a plateau instead?
So the question, I think, if it's did the manual dexterity decline over the course of the number of dives? It looks like, so in this initial, just because I've just done the initial kind of survey, cursory look at the data, it looks like some of the variables did decrease and some didn't. So some stayed the same. So that's where, if for future directions, because I collected so many different tests, I was doing pinch test and grip, and then that little pegboard thing, and the little red and black pucks and all that. If I can look at which ones are actually changing, then I would only test those in the future. So why test something that's not changing, that's not really telling you anything? So that was part of this pilot study, was to look, okay, we've got all these possible tests, which ones are actually meaningful for manual dexterity? Because it does look like there wasn't a lot of change. Mm-hmm. So the follow-up question from Alan there was the pegboard test and then the Minnesota, did they decline? The pegboard surprisingly statistically wasn't declined, even though it seemed like they were getting fewer pegs, but when you run the stats on it, it just wasn't significant. So that was really interesting for me to see. The Minnesota, which is the red and black kind of pucks one, that one did have a slight decline, but I need to look at, I haven't looked at all the variables. I've looked at per dive. I'm curious to see if there's any correlation with, so some of the other aspects I'm interested to look at is like your body mass index and oxygen saturation and some of those other variables to see whether that's having an effect, and I haven't looked yet for that one. But I was surprised about the pegboard that they weren't, it didn't seem to decline. That was the one that I thought for sure, because those tiny little pegs were pretty hard to even pick up. But go figure, I don't know. Yeah. Any other questions for me? Yeah.
Was each dive about the same time? Or is it shorter, longer, relatively the same?
Yeah, so the question was about the dive time, whether they were kind of similar or shorter or longer. They definitely were pretty variable, especially by the fourth dive, because the fourth dive was more of a, it wasn't as confined by the course structure. It was like a free, just go have fun dive for the students. And so some actually were underwater quite a bit longer. Whereas the other dives, I think because they had a task to do, they had a direct, objective. You got to go do this transect for 50 meters and collect this data. They were much more similar in time length to each other, each buddy team. Yeah, so there was some variability in the overall data set, but yeah. Again, they're new divers too, so there's typically, again, for the folks watching here or online who aren't divers, we tend to see usually with new divers that their dives are quite a bit shorter. Then as you become more familiar with equipment and comfortable and your breathing kind of calms down, your dives tend to be longer, but it depends too what your goal and objective, of course, is for the dive. Yeah. I mean, I think in a more controlled setting, like if I could put all these folks in like a lab, you could have a completely set time. Like you're going to be underwater for, an hour and a half. It'd be very different than field collected data. But I wanted it to be a kind of a real assessment of like working actual divers going out and doing their thing. Yeah. Anything else? Feeling sleepy? Time for dinner? Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the question was, was there any other data that I could compare to, or has this been done essentially in the past? There is in air, like air exposed occupational manual dexterity data that was collected a lot in the Scandinavian countries, so a lot out of Sweden and Norway, looking at workers who work outside in the cold and kind of how that affects their hands. So whether they're operating machinery or a lot of construction workers kind of stuff. So that I was able to find. Underwater though, like immersion, whether it's diving or just your hands are under the water for whatever reason, there's not a lot, which was interesting. There was a small study that was a master's student. It was her thesis. So it wasn't even published her thesis was just published. It wasn't like in a journal. NASA has done some stuff. They put their astronauts underwater and they use scuba divers also for their training. So they had done a little bit of data on this, but there's, surprisingly not a ton. And I don't know if it's a funding thing, perhaps, getting money and justifying that it's needed. I think it's generally just accepted that, our hands don't function as well when they're cold, and live with it and figure out, workarounds and wear gloves, But yeah, there wasn't a ton especially for divers. Yeah. Good question. All right. Well, thank you all very much, for coming out and being here in person at our awesome library, and thanks to the folks who tuned in online.